Okay, well, thanks very much for coming along to the first of these. I'm Edward Gillen, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here. And hopefully today I'm going to sort of give some kind of explanation as to what this is and why I've been hauling it around for the past month. In September 1846, Isambard Kingdom Brunel's largely iron SS Great Britain ran aground off the Irish coast. It was beached on Dundrum Bay. This wasn't just a minor navigation error, this was a complete catastrophe. He hadn't just caught the edge of Ireland, the ship had actually run plumb into the side of the Irish coast. It was beached on Dundrum Bay, here it is here. It would take months to get it off the beach, and it would end up bankrupting the company that built it. It was a complete disaster. Why had this happened? Well, there were rumours that the captain had been drunk, incompetent, the crew had not been very good at navigation, but some of the most alarming rumours that circulated around Victorian society were that the ship's compass, its magnetic compass, had been compromised by the iron used to build the ship. Now, of course, geographic north is different to magnetic north. The magnetic North Pole wanders, it changes, and the angle of degree that it varies from geographic North Pole changes over time. And for Victorian society, this was very alarming because obviously Victorian Britain had this huge booming empire, it was controlling a lot of the world's trade, and this was all built on shipping, which was using an increasing amount of iron. And the problem is that if you put iron in a ship, either the hull, even cannons, the steam engines, there's a chance that this might interfere with the needle, the compass, that you're using to navigate. Now, this phenomena is known as magnetic deviation. Right? But there are three principal qualities to the Earth's magnetic field. There is, of course, the magnetic North Pole, which moves around in relation to the geographic North Pole. If you imagine the Earth as a sort of giant bar magnet, basically the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field changes as well as you move around. So if you imagine a magnet, the strongest point of magnetic force are at the poles of the magnet, and as you move around the magnet, the intensity of the magnetic force diminishes. If you model that up to the Earth, as you move towards the equator, or the magnetic equator, which moves, the magnetic intensity of the field diminishes. And at the same time, the angle of the Earth's magnetic field changes depending on where you are in the world. This is known as the dip. Basically, if you have a compass and you suspend it horizontally and you put it over the North Pole, it should make a 90-degree angle. It should come down straight. And as you move around the world, the needle's angle changes until you get to the magnetic equator, where it should reach 0 degrees because there's very little magnetic force acting on it. Now, these three phenomena of deviation, intensity, and dip, they had been known before the 19th century. I think that the phenomena of magnetic deviation was first observed in about 1492, and the phenomena of magnetic dip was, I think, about 1581 by the compass maker Robert Norman in London, who noticed when he was building compasses that as you point them towards the north, they start to wobble. If you've ever played around with a compass that hasn't got water in it, you can see how the needle sometimes is dragged down as the Earth pole is not just pulling it in a direction, but also pulling it in a certain angle. So these problems, these questions of the Earth's magnetic field had long been known. But in the 19th century, they carry increased urgency because of Britain's growing empire, the rising use of iron, the rise of shipping, commerce, trade, but also because of the rise of naval exploration. Let's go to 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo. Britain's been involved in some 20 years of conflict with France. But after 1815, there's not a lot for the Royal Navy to do. Britain has this huge navy, but there's no Napoleonic Empire for it to be fighting anymore. So what are all these naval officers going to do? Well, some of them decide to start organising expeditions up to the northern seas, up sort of trying to find the Northwest Passage or moving towards the magnetic North Pole. And from about 1818, you start to see expeditions being organised by the Admiralty, and they send expeditions up exploring. The first really famous of these is 1818 under the command of the Captain John Ross, who went up towards the Northwest Passage, got to a place called Lancaster Sound, saw some clouds in the distance, thought they were mountains and sailed home. When he got back to London, of course, he was completely torn apart. But expeditions continued to be conducted throughout the late 1810s and through the 1820s. In 1829, an expedition, again under the command of Captain John Ross, sailed in search of the magnetic North Pole. They sailed up towards, I suppose, sort of this region up here of Canada, and they got stuck in the ice. His nephew, James Clark Ross, went off on sledges with a dipping needle, an earlier version of one of these that I'll talk about later on, and he reached, I believe, about 89 degrees north. Of course, 90 would mean that he'd reached the North Pole, and despite the fact that the expedition got stuck in the ice and the crews were only saved by a passing whale ship, they almost all died. They did manage to get back to London, and after comparing calculations with those taken in London, they could claim that they had actually reached the magnetic North Pole in 1831. Now, back in Britain, this is all phenomenally exciting because science in the 1820s and 1830s is becoming increasingly fashionable. Well-to-do, middle-class, increasingly learned portions of British society are starting to take an interest in the sciences, in geology, which is very gentlemanly, and the electrical sciences as well. Of course, at the Royal Institution in London, you've got Michael Faraday performing fantastically exciting experiments, exposing electrical phenomena throughout the 1820s and early 1830s. It's in 1831 that all this enthusiasm, this public enthusiasm for science comes together in York at the first meeting of what becomes known as the British Association for the Advancement of Science, the same year that the magnetic North Pole is reached. And basically, it's agreed amongst the leading scientific authorities in the country at the time that there's a need to map how the Earth's magnetic field operates in terms of dip, deviation, and intensity. Basically, it's a giant survey. You build instruments like this, and you send them out across the world. You take measurements, and then you plot those measurements onto a map, and you produce huge, great charts to see how these lines of force that are coming out of the magnet that is the Earth are actually operating. And in 1833, they begin by launching a survey of the British Isles, which is largely undertaken by James Clark Ross, fresh back from the expedition, Edward Sabine, who's completely potty about magnetism, and Humphrey Lloyd. And basically they travel around the British Isles, carrying horizontal compasses. Magnetic dipping needle is basically just a compass on its side, taking measurements of the magnetic field around the British Isles, and they produce these fantastic, huge maps. And it's this group of individuals who basically then say, well, actually, it's all very well knowing the magnetic field of the Earth, of Great Britain. What we really need is a global survey. We need to know how magnetism operates across the whole world. And throughout the 1830s, the leading British authorities in science lead this campaign to secure government funding. And this is government funding of science on an unprecedented scale, which, I mean, is fantastically interesting in terms of the relationship between state and science throughout history. It's magnetic science that really gets this going on a large scale. The argument they make to the government is this is very practical. If we understand the laws of magnetism, this will make for better navigation. And it's worth bearing in mind that actually the more countries seem to use iron in their shipping, there is an alarming tendency for these ships to go missing or run aground, like Brunel's ship, the SS Great Britain. And I think it's about, by 1852, it's about every year, for every 210 ships in Britain, about one of them is going missing or sinking. And there are fears that this is because of magnetic phenomena. Well, the campaign to get funding for this magnetic survey is successful. In 1839, the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, agrees to provide funding for an expedition to the South Pole, to try and find the magnetic South Pole and to map the magnetic field in the southern seas around Antarctica. He agrees to pay for 2 ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, to sail down there, and along the way to found 3 magnetic observatories that will be left along behind them as they travel, to keep a record of magnetism at fixed locations to compare with the ships that are moving. And this is where this needle comes in, because to be able to do this, to be able to survey the Earth's magnetic field, you need really, really good instruments. I mean, how on earth do you measure the Earth's magnetic intensity? It's a pretty difficult problem. You can measure deviation very easily. You take a chart, you find out where north is, and then you take a compass and you find out where magnetic north is, and the degree difference between the two, that's your deviation. In terms of magnetic dip, you just simply have a needle, as you can see here, you have a needle suspended horizontally, you take it around the world, and as you move, the needle changes, you measure the degrees, and that tells you what the dip is. But this is brilliant because it measures the Earth's intensity. It actually weighs the Earth's magnetic intensity. But we'll come back to that in a moment. This instrument was designed by a Cornishman, a Cornish natural philosopher, a Quaker by the name of Robert Weir Fox. Now, Robert Weir Fox was very interested in mining. Cornish mines, of course, what Cornishman in the 19th century wasn't obsessed with mines. And he was very interested in how subterranean mineral veins formed, how copper and tin, how the deposits lay through the earth. And he starts theorizing over how they might have formed, and he comes to believe that there are subterranean electrical currents moving around the earth, which are related to the magnetic field of the earth, and that these currents, basically they are causing minerals to form into veins deep below ground over the course of huge expanses of time. So he starts charting these mineral veins and how they lay, and to do this he starts using very, very sophisticated compasses, miners' compasses that you take down below, and they measure the dip or the movement of mineral veins in relation to compass directions. And he's doing these sort of experiments, this investigation throughout the 1820s. But by the 1830s, of course, it's magnetic science, geomagnetism, that is really where it's at. That's something that's very trendy, very exciting. And Robert Weir Fox realizes that the instrument makers who have been making the devices that he's been using to record mineral deposits underground might also be used on board ships to measure the Earth's magnetic field around the world. So he designs a very early prototype of this in 1832 and has it built in London. He then has a more sophisticated model of this built in 1834 in Falmouth by an instrument maker called Thomas Jordan, who he'd actually brought down from Bristol to teach his children to draw. And over the next 5 or 6 years, he refines the needle, perfects it, and works out how you measure the Earth's magnetic intensity. He also builds up networks. He becomes, through the British Association for the Advancement of Science, he meets people like James Clark Ross, he meets Sir John Franklin, he meets all the big wigs at the Admiralty, and he is provided with many opportunities for showing off his needles and showing off what they can do, trying to get the patronage of the Admiralty and the Royal Navy. He also takes part in the surveying of the British Isles. He contributes in 1835. He does a lot of the charting for Ireland and the southwest of England. But what is his solution to the question of magnetic intensity? This is Robert Weir Fox here, a very scholarly individual. And this is his needle, for those of you who can't see the needle in the foreground. So we have the first thing about this. The needle for measuring dip is very, very delicate. It sits on a jeweled pallet, which is made of ruby. So it's very, very hard, very finely made. It oscillates very, very smoothly in theory, and this one actually does. The interesting thing about this is that before this needle, usually dip needles just sat on a hinge. They just rested, which of course means that you can't get beneath a certain angle before. Well, anyway, this is much better for traveling at sea. But there's a process here. This is the kit that you'd be equipped with. You get one of these, an ivory rubber, which you tap along the back of the needle to make the needle vibrate, to remove any static, and also just to bring it to life sometimes. You get a box of weights. These are 2 grains, 1 grain. I think they eventually go down to about 0.125 of a grain. They're absolutely tiny. You get a pair of tweezers that I forgot to photograph for applying the weights to the needle. These are called deflectors. We'll see how those work in a moment. Hooks for the weights and a spare needle. There's the spare needle inside the case, and basically you keep one in good condition and one in the needle, and then when you go around the world you kind of check them to compare to see if this has lost any of its magnetic intensity. Now, to measure the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field, you take a dip. So let's say we get to a part of the world, we point this towards the North Pole, and the needle comes to a dip of, say, 15 degrees. On the back of the needle is another dial with a vernier somewhere here, and you line that up to where the dip is, and then you screw in these deflectors. I should have a better picture somewhere. Yes. You screw in the deflectors at the back. Now these have magnetic bars in them. And what that does is it introduces a fixed constant magnetism to the needle, and it causes the needle to move away from its measurement. So let's say that the needle was showing 15 degrees. We put these magnets on the back, and let's say it's then showing 40 degrees. Now, we then, on the needle, is a grooved wheel. We put some thread around the wheel and some hooks. We come to the pot of weights, and we start applying the weights to the hooks. And we coerce the needle back to 15 degrees. So basically we correct it back to the dip. You have a permanent magnetic force that is applied, and then you work out how much weight it takes to get the needle to go back to what the dip is. Now you see, the thing is, as you travel around the Earth, the strength of the Earth's magnetic field diminishes. So of course it takes less weight to correct the needle. Basically, the Earth's magnetic field is fighting the 2 deflectors on the back of the dip needle. And you're trying to balance them out with weights. And so let's say we've got a 40-degree deflection from our original 15-degree dip. To get it back to 15 degrees, it might take, say, 3 grains. So what we found there is that it's 3 grains of weight. That's how strong the Earth's magnetic field is. But as we get closer to the North Pole, the Earth's magnetic field gets stronger, and it might take 4 or 5 grains to get the deflection back to the level of dip. So it is actually very, very clever, this needle, in terms of how you are literally weighing the Earth's magnetic field, which I think is pretty clever for 1840. And this is as a way of a comparison. This is what most other dip needles are looking like at the time. You see, it's very delicate indeed. This is built for being carried around the world. It's pretty sturdy. It's pretty good on a ship. and it's incredibly elaborate. And this one here, this is built by Thomas Robson, a London instrument maker. This was actually the dip needle that was in use between 1842 and 1860. Was it 1846 and 60? Anyway, 1840s and 1850s at the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. And it's a very, very intricate, delicate device, and it's very accurate. But you can't calculate the Earth's intensity with it. It just gives you dip. So, let's go back to 1839. Terra and Erebus, they're ready to go to the South Pole, and they're equipped with 2 of these, because obviously to measure the Earth's field, they're going to have to take some instruments. And the Admiralty, James Clark Ross in particular, who is appointed captain of this expedition, is hugely impressed with Robert Weir Fox's needle. And, I mean, he's seen it in action, he's used it himself. Very impressed with it, and he gets himself one built specifically for the expedition, 7 inches, the needle's 7 inches long. For the second ship of the expedition, there are 2 ships. For HMS Terror, he gets a 4-inch needle purchased. So you have 2 of these needles, 1 on each ship. They sail around the world, they take measurements, and when you've got 2 needles, you can sort of see how you can compare the results to see how accurate they are. This is the very dashing Captain James Clark Ross, commander of the expedition. And actually, in terms of propaganda, Victorian propaganda, down here in the corner is a small dipping needle, which I think emphasizes the significance of the science of magnetism to this age of exploration in the mid-19th century. Interestingly, his uncle, John Ross, who missed out on reaching the magnetic North Pole in 1831, he stayed on board the ship, was, I think, quite jealous of James Clark Ross. He was probably, sort of one of the real heroes of the 19th century, a real pinner. And his second was Captain Crozier aboard HMS Terror, who was also a very able magnetic observer. Anyway, so sorry about this. They sail for the Antarctic, HMS Terror and Erebus. Terror and Erebus. They sailed out via Madeira to Cape Verde, St. Helena, and Cape Town. They found magnetic observatories at St. Helena and Cape Town, and then they sailed across the Indian Ocean to the barren Kerguelen Island. They stopped there for a couple of months, and then they go on to Hobart. Along the way, they take magnetic measurements. They take 167 magnetic measurements between London and the Cape. The 2 observatories that they found at St. Helena and Cape Town are built over the next few months. They leave behind small groups under the command of Lieutenant Lefroy at St. Helena and Lieutenant, I forget his name, at Cape Town. And they build permanent magnetic observatories there, while they sail on to Hobart. And at Hobart, they reach Hobart in August 1840, and there they're welcomed by Sir John Franklin, incredibly enthusiastic about the science of magnetism. He took the post of governor of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, about 2 years before, on the understanding that this would become a centre of magnetic science. He sees it as his mission to turn Hobart into a centre, sort of almost a scientific renaissance where magnetism will be very central. They get to Hobart. Sir John provides a group of convicts to help build the observatory, and they erect one in 9 days. And they perform magnetic experiments at Hobart before then carrying on down to the Antarctic. In early 1841, after breaking through the pack ice south of New Zealand, Terror and Erebus reach the Antarctic only to find that it's a landmass and they won't actually be able to reach the South Magnetic Pole. However, James Clark Ross uses his Fox dipping needle to calculate that they have reached 88 degrees south, so just 2 degrees from the South Magnetic Pole, which allows him to reasonably accurately pinpoint where the South Magnetic Pole was. They don't actually reach it, because they're not equipped to go over land. The South Magnetic Pole, obviously it moves, but I think the South Magnetic Pole wasn't reached until about 1909 by Shackleton, although I forget what kind of instrument he was carrying, but they did have a Fox needle for that expedition, but I don't think it was used to actually pinpoint the South Magnetic Pole by then. However, although they don't reach the South Magnetic Pole in 1841, they do discover the Ross Sea. They find the Ross Ice Shelf, the Ross Penguin. They find a live, ferocious volcano, which they name Mount Erebus, and another one, Mount Terror. They also name a load of mountains after people that had promoted the magnetic expedition. There's a Mount Sabine, a Mount John Herschel, a Mount William Whewell, all the big names of Victorian science. Captain Crozier has a cape named after him. And in the end, they make three voyages to the Antarctic, mapping the magnetism of the seas around the landmass and the ice. And they head back to Britain in 1843 via the Falklands. When they get back, it's a huge success, a huge triumph. The Fox needle is absolutely celebrated as probably one of the most sophisticated, cutting-edge instruments in the 1840s. It's celebrated. I mean, this is the instrument that pinpoints the South Magnetic Pole. And Edward Sabine, who publishes the findings of this expedition, says that they simply wouldn't have been able to find the South Magnetic Pole without the instrument. Who knows, maybe he was right. But anyway, the needle goes down, it becomes very famous, very celebrated. And throughout the 1840s, British expeditions, naval expeditions, carried Fox needles around the world. There's probably a couple of dozen of them built in total. Most of them are still being built down in Falmouth by the instrument maker Thomas Jordan. But Thomas Jordan, he has eyes for bigger prizes, and he moves up to London, and he leaves behind down in Falmouth his foreman, William George, who takes over the practice and continues building Fox needles to the same pattern. And this one is built by William George. William George took over the business in 1841, and he was building needles between 1841 and 1845. So although I can't tell you exactly when this was built, it was sometime within that period. Fox needles are carried on several of the most celebrated expeditions of the day. This is at the Antarctic, Ross on Terror and Erebus. A nice whale in the foreground and some sort of sea life on a... 1841, there's an expedition to the River Niger. They're equipped with a couple of Fox needles. They sail up the River Niger, taking magnetic measurements aboard HMS Wilberforce, HMS Albert, and HMS Sudan. Unfortunately, although they take fantastic magnetic measurements, unfortunately a lot of the crew die from tropical disease. Their ships were actually designed with this fantastically ingenious system of ventilation, believing that tropical disease was spread by bad air rather than mosquitoes. They decided that the ship should be ventilating units. Although an awful lot of the crew died, it was worth it for the magnetic measurements, no doubt. This is James Clark Ross's needle, as you can see, virtually identical. This is the one up at Greenwich. And it's needles like this that were carried to the River Niger. In 1843, Edward Belcher sails out to the Far East, to Borneo and Japan and Korea. He takes Fox needles, measuring the Earth's magnetism. It's the real driving force behind Victorian exploration in the 1840s. And I mean, the stories that he sends back are absolutely fantastic. You know, has to stop to take measurements on land and is surrounded by pirates from Borneo who attack the instrument. He's forced to run with it back to the ship. Henry Lefroy surveys Canada with one of these. Unfortunately sets it up on a tripod in a field, only for it to get knocked over by a cow. On another occasion, his canoe fell over and the instruments fell out and the glass broke. So they weren't quite so good on land as they were at sea. 1846 to 1850, Captain Owen Stanley takes Fox needles as he circumnavigates the globe on HMS Samarang. So they have a fantastically varied, and I mean, they're part of a sort of world system of magnetic observation. But all was not well. Things were about to go drastically wrong. In 1845, Sir John Franklin had returned from Hobart, and he was eager to lead an expedition, a magnetic survey, up to the Northwest Passage. Now, most people will have, I'm presuming, heard something about the Franklin expedition on board Terror and Erebus again. Most people think that it was to try and find a path through the Northwest Passage, a route through to the Pacific. But in fact, the prime objective of this expedition was magnetism. It was magnetic surveying. And they take a Fox needle with them. We don't really know what happened to the expedition. They got stuck in the ice sometime in late 1845, 1846, and the crew almost certainly ended up eating each other. But the last letters that we have from the expedition, sent from Whalefish Island, just between Greenland and Canada, I think, the needle was a complete disaster. Around the dial, the instrument maker, William George, who made this, forgot to cut minutes. He put degrees, but he didn't put any divisions of the degrees. The officer on board, James Fitzjames, writes a letter back to Edward Sabine and says that it's completely useless, he can't use it, it won't settle properly. Even Captain Crozier, who had been with Sir James Clark Ross between 1839 and 1843, says that the Fox needle is terrible. James Fitzjames writes back to London in his last letter, I'm sure he would have wanted it that way, saying that his fox was rotten. The expedition ended in disaster, not just for the magnetic readings. The crew end up abandoning ship and trying to walk south, and all that are found are debris, remains. This is a boot that was found in Starvation Bay, along with some bones. The bones where the joints are, there are actually cuts where you can see that the muscle tissue has been taken off to be consumed. There's no doubt that the crews, we don't know to what extent they ate each other. But amongst the bones was found in 1859 this. This is a magnetic dipping needle built by Thomas Robinson of London. It was built in about 1840, and it was carried along with their Fox needle on the Franklin expedition. And this is one of the last things that the desperate, starving crew of Franklin's expedition abandoned. The magnetic zeal, the determination to advance magnetic science followed them through to the last stages of the expedition. I don't know whether they were still performing magnetic experiments when they started eating each other, but I'm sure it helped pass the time. But of course, the reputation of the instrument maker William George suffered as much as the poor crews of Sir John's expedition. William George down in Falmouth was never trusted again by the Admiralty. Edward Sabine writes to Robert Weir Fox and says, find a different instrument maker, which he does. And that really is the end of the career of the individual who built this needle, but not the end of the career for Robert Weir Fox. But I suppose I should conclude by perhaps just saying a few words about this needle and its history and why it's here. This needle is actually the property of the Royal Cornwall Polytechnic Society, a very handsome building built in 1836 in Falmouth High Street. And if ever any of you end up in that wilderness of the UK, I suggest you go and have a look. It's a very fine building and a good example of civic scientific architecture at the time. This was founded by the three children of Robert Weir Fox. His three children, Anna Maria, I think she was 17, Barclay Fox, he was 15, and Caroline Fox at the age of 13. They got together in 1833 and they said, Falmouth needs a scientific institution, let's found one. They got lots of local money, and this is what they established. And at their earliest exhibitions, it was a Fox needle that was celebrated as one of the finest outputs of Cornish science. Not just Cornish science, but world science. This is Cornish natural philosophy exerting influence over the whole globe. In about 1880, the Admiralty returned one of its needles to the Polytechnic. And this is it. It was put in a basement and it sat there for the last 130 years, undisturbed, untouched, and that's why it works. These needles are very, very temperamental. They lose magnetism over time, but because this has been kept in its original box, with all of its equipment, stowed away in the basement down in Falmouth, it does still work. And that's really what I've been doing over the past few months, is seeing how well and how accurately it works. And we've had some dodgy readings along the way, but it certainly does know what hemisphere we're in. Yeah, anyway, so the Poly were very, very kind to say, you know, I suggested as a joke, why not let me take it along the route of James Clark Ross in 1839 down to Cape Town, and they said, haha, very funny, and then a couple of weeks later said, go ahead. And it will return there at the end of this voyage, hopefully. Although I have been warned that should anything happen to it, I'll no longer be welcome. Not just because I am a Devonian, but I will no longer be welcome on that side of the Tamar. So, just to conclude, what is the significance of this needle? Well, I think that rather excitingly, this needle is part of a moment in history where the entire world is being conceived of as a giant laboratory. The thing with magnetic surveying is that it is a global project. It's not just a global project, it's a project that requires a huge amount of state funding. But it's also a project in the 19th century which is completely inseparable from the spread of empire and imperialism. Science and empire were completely indivisible. The thing is that as you sail around the world trying to take magnetic measurements, you're brought into contact with new people and new lands. And actually these expeditions, they weren't about colonialism, they weren't about finding territory, they weren't about exploiting resources, they were about mapping magnetism. So, but of course one of the byproducts of this is that it does actually, you know, facilitate the spread of empire. So science and imperialism were inseparably bound, but they were completely contingent and reliant on incredibly delicate, very, very fine devices, of which this is an absolutely fantastic example. Thanks very much.